Hello everyone and welcome once again to our TOP course. And in this lesson we will be learning about Rogers and his person-centered theory. Now to begin, Carl Ransom Rogers is widely regarded as one of the most eminent thinkers in psychology, and he is best known for developing the psychotherapy method called client-centered therapy and for being one of the founders of humanistic psychology. He was born on January 8, 1902 in Oak Park, Illinois, and he died on February 4, 1987 in Loyola, California. His father was a civil engineer and his mother was a housewife, and he was fourth of six children, and Rogers was a high achiever in school from an early age. He even started reading before age 5 and was able to skip kindergarten and first grade. As an adolescent, the young Carl was extremely shy, had no close friends, and had an active fantasy life. And he was originally interested in farming, and then he got interest in religion and graduated educational and clinical psychology. When he was 12, his family moved from the suburbs to a rural farm area, and he enrolled at the University of Wisconsin in 1919 as an agriculture major. However, after attending a 1992 Christian conference in China, Rogers began to question his career choice, and he later changed his major to history with plans of becoming a minister. He graduated from the University of Wisconsin in 1924 with a bachelor's degree in history and enrolled at the Union Theological Seminary before transferring to Teachers College of Columbia University in 1926 to complete his master's degree. And one reason he chose to abandon his pursuit of theology was a student-led seminar on religion, which caused him to question his own faith. Another inspiration for his switch to the study of psychology was the course he took at Columbia University. And one of his teachers was Letta Stetter Hollingworth, one of the pioneers of the draw a person assessment tool, and one of the pioneer psychologist of her time. Rogers considered psychology to be a way to continue studying life's many questions without having to subscribe to a specific doctrine, and he decided to enroll in the clinical psychology program at Columbia and completed his doctorate in 1931. After receiving his PhD, Rogers spent a number of years working in the academe, holding positions at the Ohio State University, the University of Chicago, and the University of Wisconsin. And it was during this time that Rogers was able to develop his approach to therapy, which he initially termed non-directive therapy, meaning to say it is the client who would be the one directing the flow of therapy, compared to the approach in the psychotherapy of psychoanalysis and many other approaches, wherein it is the therapist that would be mandating the flow and the pace of the therapeutic session. This approach, which involves the therapist acting as a facilitator, meaning guiding and asking questions, and also facilitating the client's experience, are one of the roles of the facilitator or the counselor, rather than directing the therapeutic session, which he eventually called client-centered therapy later on. In 1946, Rogers was elected president of the American Psychological Association, and Rogers wrote 19 books and numerous articles outlining his humanistic theory. Among his best-known works are The Client-Centered Therapy in 1951, on becoming a person in 1961, and a way of being in 1980. After some conflicts within the psychology department at the University of Wisconsin, Rogers accepted a position at the Western Behavioral Studies Institute in Loyola, California. And eventually, he and his colleagues left WBSI to form the Center for Studies of the Person, or the CSP. Now, let's go to the overview of his person-centered theory. The personal preference of Rogers was to be a helper of people and not a constructor of theories. He developed a humanistic theory of personality that grew out of his experience as a practicing psychotherapist, and he emphasized the growth of the patient, or he would prefer to call client, rather than the identification and labeling of disorders. But in the practice, client and patient are synonymously being understood or used. The sole emphasis of Rogers' therapy was on the client-therapist relationship, called the non-directive technique. Meaning to say, the counselor would not be interpreting whatever it is that the patient or the client would be sharing. But instead, he or she is bound to listen, to reflect, and to ask questions. Let's go now to Rogers' basic assumptions. He made mention about the formative tendency. Rogers believed that there is a tendency for all matter, both organic and inorganic, to evolve from simpler to more complex forms. Just take, for example, look at a seed. After it becomes a seedling, and it has its tendency that when it is under shade, it would actually be extending its stem to look for the sunlight. For the entire universe, a creative process rather than a disintegrative one is in operation. The actualizing tendency, for him, it is an interrelated and more pertinent assumption, which refers to the tendency within all humans and other animals and plants to move toward completion or fulfillment of potentials. According to Rogers, this tendency is the only motive that people possess. The need to satisfy one's hunger drive, to express deep emotions when they are felt, and to accept oneself are all examples of the single motive of self-actualization. Actualization involves the whole person because each person operates as one complete organism. And there are two tendencies subsumed within the actualizing tendency of the person. First is that there is the need for maintenance, which is similar to the lower steps on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It includes such basic needs, including food, air, and safety. But it also includes the tendency to resist change and to seek the status quo. Even though people have a strong desire to maintain the status quo, they are willing to learn and to challenge and to also change. And this need become more to develop, and the change or the and to achieve growth is called enhancement. So to speak, our actualizing tendency involves maintenance, and also the need to become more entails that we also embrace enhancement. And he made mention in his theory that a human's actualizing tendency is realized only under certain conditions, such as empathy, unconditional positive regard, and also congruence. Empathy speaks more about being in another person's shoes and understanding the situation. Unconditional positive regard is also present in the other person when he or she is listening to the client. There is no such thing as a condition being set in order for him or her or therapist to listen to the client. And also congruence, meaning the therapist's body message and facial features are also congruent with what is also being uttered and being said in the therapeutic relationship. The self and the self-actualization. Infants begin to develop a vague concept of the self when a portion of their experience becomes personalized and differentiated in awareness as I or the me experiences. And they begin to evaluate experiences as positive and negative. Self-actualization is a subset of the actualization tendency and is therefore not synonymous with actualization tendency. Actualization tendency refers to the organismic experiences of the individual, and that is, it refers to the whole person. On the other hand, self-actualization, which is just a subset of the actualization tendency, is the tendency to actualize self as perceived in one's consciousness or one's awareness. So it is our own perception to actualize ourselves in our own awareness. While actualization tendency, it has this general and bigger, a macroscopic picture about the person's experience becoming a whole person. The organism and the perceived self must be in harmony so that a discrepancy does not exist between actualization tendency and self-actualization, meaning there is no such thing as a great disparity between the organism and the perceived self. It could be the real self and also the ideal self. Because if there is a big disparity or difference between the ideal self and the real self, then that is where a problem would eventually exist. The self-concept includes all those aspects of one's being and one's experiences that are perceived in awareness by the individual. Self-concept is not identical with the organismic self because the portions of the organismic self may be beyond a person's awareness or simply not owned by that person. Thus, once people form their self-concept, they find change and significant learnings quite difficult. Experiences that are inconsistent with their self-concept usually are either denied or they are accepted only in distorted forms. So to speak, the self-concept basically includes those aspects of one's being and one's experiences that are perceived in awareness. And when it comes to the organismic self, we could say that part of the organism, like the stomach, it is not part of the self-concept unless it malfunctions. Another concept being made by Rogers in his theory is the concept of the ideal self. The ideal self is defined as one's views of the self as one wishes to be. The ideal self contains all those attributes, usually positive, that people aspire to possess. While on the other hand, without awareness, the self-concept and the ideal self would not exist. Rogers defined awareness as the symbolic representation of some portion of our experience. And likely, incongruence could be present when there is a wide gap between our self concept and our ideal self. So let's go now to the levels of awareness being identified by Carl Rogers. He believed that some events are experienced below the threshold of awareness and are either ignored or denied. Second, some experiences are accurately symbolized and freely admitted to the self's structure. And it is also consistent with the self concept. And third is that experiences that are perceived in a distorted form, they could be inconsistent with the self concept, meaning they could not allow them to be present in the person's awareness, and that's why they are being distorted. Basically, they don't agree with that specific description of themselves by other people or the way people see them. And that's why they are being distorted as they are being perceived by the individual. Now, with regard to the person's perception, it is not only negative or derogatory experiences that are distorted or denied to awareness. Positive experiences like genuine compliments, positive feedback may not be accepted by the individual. And that is the denial of the positive experiences. So let's take, for example, a student who performs very well and who may also lack that trust in himself, even when the teacher has given compliments about his or her performance. Still, these experiences of positive compliments or positive experiences are not being accepted by the individual. And why does this happen? They may be distorted because the person distrusts the giver, or they may be denied because the recipient does not feel they are deserving of them, especially when they are also being exposed with that specific condition every time. In all cases, a compliment from another also implies the right of that person to criticize or to condemn, and thus the compliment carries an implied threat instead of accepting and embracing the positive experience. In Rogers' theory, this is one of the most important step and condition he emphasized in his theory on becoming a person, to become a person once again. First, an individual must make contact, meaning it could be a positive or a negative experience with another person. This is the minimum experience for becoming a person. So you come into contact, you come into an interaction with a person, may it be a positive experience or a negative one. After experiencing contact, they become aware that another person has some measure of regard for them. And the person then develops a need to be loved, to be liked, or accepted by another person, referred to as the positive regard. Just like with our parents, we want their appreciation, we want their compliments, we want to be in that positive condition whenever they are around and whenever we are with them. Positive regard is a prerequisite for positive self-regard. So when you could be receiving positive regard from other people, you would also be having a positive self-regard upon yourself, which is also defined as the experience of prizing or valuing oneself. Now, in this particular experience, the perception of the self is not being distorted. But in this condition, there is that presence of the prizing and valuing oneself. Now, what are the barriers to psychological health? So let's start with the conditions of worth. So instead of receiving unconditional positive regard coming from people, most people receive conditions of worth. And that is, they perceive their parents, peers, or partners' love and accept them only. Now, there is that condition only if they meet those people's expectations and approval. So there is that condition of worth that if you are beautiful, then you would be loved by your partner. If you are an achiever, then that's the only time you are being loved by your parents. If you are good and performing well in school, then you are likely to be treated fairly by your parents, as how your siblings are also being treated. We gradually assimilate into our self-structure the attitudes we perceive others expressing toward us, and in time, we begin to evaluate experiences on this basis. And our perceptions of other people's view are called the external evaluations. So like for example, whenever your parents would be looking at you and staring at you as you begin to also perform well in school, it could be an external evaluation. Whenever they would be frowning, that could be a negative external evaluation. As simple as those cues, no? They basically provide the conditions of worth as to how you would be given approval and acceptance in the environment that you are into. Incongruence is also a barrier to psychological health. Organism and the self are the two separate entities that may or may not be congruent with one another. Psychological disequilibrium begins when we fail to recognize our organismic experiences as self-experiences. When we don't accurately symbolize organismic experiences into awareness because they appear to be inconsistent with our emerging self-concept, and that is when incongruence would happen. Another is vulnerability. Rogers believed that people are vulnerable when they are unaware of the discrepancy between their organismic self and their significant experience. Anxiety and threat are experienced as we gain awareness of the incongruence between the organismic self and the self-concept. So if there is that big disparity, anxiety and threat would likely be experienced by the person after he or she has been made aware of that disparity. Both can represent steps toward psychological health because they signal us that our organismic experience is inconsistent with our self-concept. And nevertheless, they are not pleasant or comfortable feelings. And this is when they say that awareness per se is a form of a curative process. Meaning, to be aware is to also be alive. And to be aware is like also having a curse or having to experience a curse. When we speak of being aware about the difference or the incongruence of the organismic self and the self-concept, that might lead for the person to work on and to change towards growth. Or it could be the other way around. It could be causing unpleasant experiences, causing anxiety and threat to the person, having to be aware with the great disparity between the organismic self and the self-concept. Another barrier is defensiveness. It is the protection of the self-concept against anxiety and threat by the denial or the distortion of experiences, which are inconsistent with it. And there are two chief defenses. With distortion, we misinterpret an experience in order to fit into some aspect of our self-concept. We perceive the experience in awareness, but we fail to understand its true meaning. And with denial, we refuse to perceive an experience in awareness, or at least we keep some aspect of it from reaching symbolization. But according to Rogers, both denial and distortion serve the same purpose. They keep our perception of our organismic experiences consistent with our self-concept, which allows us to ignore or block out experiences that otherwise would cause unpleasant anxiety or threat. Meaning, we don't embrace them, we distort them, or we even deny or don't accept them. And that is when we would cause to also block the presence of unpleasant anxiety or threat through distortion or through denial of our experiences. Now, most people engage in defensive behavior, but sometimes defenses fail and behavior becomes disorganized or psychotic. Now, why do defenses fail to function? So we could trace the course of the disorganized behavior, which has the same origins as the normal defensive behavior. And that discrepancy between people's organismic experience and their view of the self. We have learned that the denial and distortion are adequate experiences to keep normal people from recognizing this discrepancy between the self-concept and the organismic self. But when the incongruence between people's perceived self and the organismic experience is either too obvious or it occurs too suddenly to be denied or to be distorted, then their behavior becomes disorganized. Disorganization can occur suddenly or it can take place gradually over a long period of time, especially when the experience is something that has also turned the person to be incapable of denying or distorting the experience. And that is when disorganization would occur, causing a havoc in the person's life, becoming disorganized, or even to an extent described as psychotic. Now, Rogerian therapy can be viewed in terms of conditions, process, and outcomes, like the if and then. The conditions, especially for anxious people, to grow psychologically, they must come into contact with a therapist who is congruent and whom they perceive as providing an atmosphere of unconditional acceptance and accurate empathy. So one of ways on how we could be able to identify that a particular client has found a congruent and also a therapist that provides an unconditional acceptance and accurate empathy is when the client would be nodding and starting to feel that he or she is in a safe environment, that all the questions being raised by the therapist makes him ponder, makes him somehow think that I am also being accepted as a person by this therapist. Second condition is that the client must perceive these characteristics in the therapist, and the contact between the client and the therapist must be of some duration. So there is also a particular mode of transaction or sessions that is to be scheduled every week in a particular mode. May it be twice in a week or twice in a month. The counselor congruence. The congruence exists when a person's organismic experiences are matched by awareness of them and by an ability to also openly express these feelings. So to be congruent means to be real or genuine, to be authentic, to be whole or integrated, to be what one truly is. And congruence involves feelings, both positive and negative. There is also awareness and an honest expression. So incongruence can and may also occur. First, if there is a breakdown between feelings and awareness. And second, if there is a discrepancy between awareness of an experience and the ability or willingness to express it. So how is this incongruence being communicated by a counselor to that of the client? Now, if there is a breakdown between feelings and awareness, meaning to say the counselor is able to also perceive that the client has been having a breakdown, crying, sobbing, and still the counselor may not feel or may not also show a gesture that he or she is able to feel that. Second, if there is also that discrepancy between awareness of the experience or the ability of or the willingness to express it, meaning the counselor would not be able to communicate what he or she feels genuinely in front of the client, what he or she truly feels. This is actually the exact opposite of congruence, wherein if our counselors are being congruent, they would not actually they wouldn't wear a mask. They don't fake any pleasant facade, meaning they are likely to also show a congruent behavior, which could be feelings of joy, elation, happiness, and many other honest expression. Unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard is the need to be liked, to be prized or accepted by another person without any conditions or qualifications. Now, showing a non-possessive warmth and acceptance, not evaluating our client's regard, means that there is a close relationship and that the therapist sees the client as an important person, a positive one. A positive condition indicates that the direction of the relationship is toward warm and caring feelings. And unconditional suggests that the positive regard is no longer dependent on specific client. May it be a client who is a criminal, a client whom you have known to be guilty. So there is that unconditional regard, regardless if the patient or the client may actually be the perpetrator or not, and does not have to be continually earned. So as a counselor, it is natural for him or her to also show unconditional positive regard. Empathic listening. Empathy exists when therapists accurately sense the feelings of their clients and are able to communicate these perceptions so that clients know that another person has entered their world of feelings without prejudice, projection, or evaluation. Empathy suggests that a therapist sees things from the client's point of view and that the client feels safe and unthreatened. In empathy, the feelings belong to the client, not the therapist. So when the therapist begins to also feel exactly how the client feels and would start to hate the person whom the client hates, then that no longer is empathy. That is already considered to be sympathy. Now, the process. If the three conditions are to be present, so if there is the presence of congruence, unconditional positive regard, and empathy, then the process of therapeutic change will be set in motion according to the person-centered theory. The stages of therapeutic change. Stage 1 is characterized by an unwillingness to communicate anything about the self. People at this stage ordinarily do not seek help. But if for some reason they come to therapy, they are extremely rigid and resistant to change. They may not be able to speak at all. And what the counselor needs to do is just to wait for the client to speak. And they do not recognize any problems and refuse to own any personal feelings or emotions. Second stage, clients become slightly less rigid. They discuss external events and other people, but they still disown or fail to recognize their own feelings. And they don't recognize any problems and refuse to own any personal feelings or emotions. And on stage 3, they are more freely to talk about their self, although still as an object. Clients talk about feelings and emotions in the past or future tense and avoid present feelings. They refuse to accept their emotions, keep personal feelings at a distance from the here and now situation, only vaguely perceive that they can make personal choices, and they deny individual responsibility for most of their decisions. Stage 4, they begin to talk of deep feelings but once personally felt. They begin to question some values that have been introjected from others, and they start to see the incongruence between their perceived self and their organismic experience. They accept more freedom and responsibility than they did in stage 3 and begin to tentatively allow themselves to become involved in a relationship with a therapist. In stage 5, they have begun to undergo significant change and growth, and they can express feelings in the present, although they have not yet accurately symbolized those feelings. And they are beginning to rely on an internal locus of evaluation for their feelings and to make fresh and new discoveries about themselves. They also experience a greater differentiation of feelings and develop more appreciation for the nuances among them. In addition, they begin to make their own decisions and to accept responsibility for their own choices. Stage 6, the experience of dramatic growth and an irreversible movement toward becoming fully functioning or self-actualizing. They freely allow into awareness those experiences that they had previously denied or distorted, and they become more congruent and are able to match their present experiences with awareness and with open expression. They no longer evaluate their own behavior from an external viewpoint, but rely on their organismic self as the criterion for evaluating experiences. And they begin to develop unconditional self-regard, which means that they have a feeling of genuine caring and affection for the person they are becoming. And this stage is also marked by physiological loosening and signals an end to therapy. And stage 7, this stage can occur outside the therapeutic encounter. Clients become fully functioning persons of tomorrow, and they are able to generalize their in-therapy experiences to their world beyond therapy. So the theoretical explanation for change. The example of the therapist enables them to prize and accept themselves, to empathically understand themselves. So what the counselor does is just to provide like a mirror for their clients. So it only goes to show that as a therapist, as a counselor, you should be a healthier individual than your client. Because if you are a mirror and you have blemishes and your patient could also see that, or your client could also see those blemishes, then the client would also think that this is not a good mirror and I need to change a mirror that does not have any stain or doesn't have any blemish. Okay. Outcomes. The most basic outcome for successful client-centered therapy is the congruent client who is less defensive and more open to experiences. Each of the remaining outcomes is a logical extension to this basic one. First is that they have more realistic view of the world. They develop positive self-regard. They narrow the gap between the ideal self and the real self. They will be less vulnerable to threat. They become less anxious. They take ownership of their experiences and they become more accepting of others and they become more congruent with others. So the person of tomorrow, if the three necessary and sufficient therapeutic conditions are optimal, these kind of person would emerge more adaptable, open to experiences. They trust in their organismic selves to live fully in the moment, known as existential living, harmonious relations with others, more integrated, have a basic trust of human nature, and there is greater richness in life. Now, according to Rogers, his philosophy of science begins and ends with subjective experience, although in between must be objective and empirical. Scientists should be completely involved in the phenomena being studied, and procedures themselves must be rigorously controlled, empirical, and objective, and the findings out from the methods are subjectively communicated. So some related research is also the self-discrepancy theory by Higgins, which is also the real self, ought self discrepancy. And the real ideal discrepancy should lead to the dejection-related emotions, just like depression, sadness, and disappointment, whereas real ought discrepancy should lead to agitation-related emotions, like anxiety, fear, and threat. So the critique of research for Rogers, his if and then framework is a theory that yields high falsification. Rogerian theory can be extended to a relatively wide range of human personality. Operational definitions were carefully worked out. Concepts such as organismic experiencing, becoming, positive self-regard, need for self-regard, unconditional self-regard, and fully functioning are too broad and imprecise to have clear scientific meaning. People have some degree of free choice and some capacity to be self-directed. His concept of humanity is realistically optimistic, and Rogers' theory is also high on teleology, maintaining that people strive with purpose towards goals that they freely set for themselves. And there is also more emphasis on individual differences and uniqueness, and people can grow in their own fashion towards the process of becoming more fully functioning. Psychological growth is shaped by social influences under nurturant and favorable conditions.